But I wanted to now read to you a couple of passages from my book that show the intersection of when racial anxiety, when xenophobia, and when Islamophobia come together all at once. This is a couple of passages from the first chapter of the book. It's called Not Our American Dream, and it relates to the massacre that happened at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. It was early on a Sunday morning in August 2012, and Paramjit Kaur was going about her morning routine. Her sons, 20-year-old Kamal and 18-year-old Harpreet, wanted to sleep in a little bit longer. So Paramjit set out on her own to the local Gurdwara, the Sikh temple of Wisconsin. Paramjit was a familiar presence at the Gurdwara, which had become a second home to her family and to many other Sikhs in Oak Creek, which is a small city located in the outskirts of Milwaukee. The Gurdwara, built in 2007 on 13 acres of land, was built by Sikh immigrants. On weekends, Sikh families would gather at the Gurdwara to pray and connect with one another. The dining hall was always filled with the sounds of people socializing and children laughing during langar, which is a free meal offered to anyone who came to the Gurdwara. Kamal and Harpreet usually hung out with their friends and played football on Sundays at the Gurdwara, while their mother helped in the kitchen and the prayer hall. But August 5th, 2012 would not turn out to be a normal Sunday for Paramjit's family or for the Oak Creek community. Soon after his mother had left the house, news reached Kamal that people inside the Sikh temple of Wisconsin were in danger. Details were scarce, and panic-stricken, Kamal rushed to the Gurdwara to find that law enforcement vehicles had blocked off the driveway. Authorities asked Kamal to wait across the street in the parking lot of a bowling alley, where he joined others also anxiously searching for information. While waiting there, Kamal and others speculated about what might be happening inside the Gurdwara. They wondered, did a dispute between community members go awry? Then their close friend, Kirandeep, received a call from her father, who was inside. He whispered to her that he was hiding in the pantry of the kitchen because he had heard gunshots. He was one of around 25 people, huddled, terrified, among bags of rice and fresh vegetables. Kirandeep's father told her not to come to the Gurdwara under any circumstances. As the day wore on, many of the people who had been inside were allowed to leave, and a fuller picture began to emerge about the rampage that had occurred inside the Gurdwara that Sunday morning. Not seeing his mother, and becoming increasingly anxious about her safety, Kamal left the parking lot. He called his friends. Together, they went from hospital to hospital, hoping that Paramjit had been brought to one. It would be a full 11 hours before authorities finally notified Kamal that his mother had been one of 6 people fatally shot inside the Gurdwara. When I first found out, I passed out, Kamal told me. I woke up in an ambulance and immediately thought of my little brother. Telling him was the hardest thing that I've ever done. This was not the future that Paramjit had envisioned for her family when she and her 2 sons moved to America from India in 2004 to join her husband, who owned a number of gas stations in Wisconsin. It wasn't the life that Paramjit had planned to build when she mustered up the courage just a few years later to begin working at a medical factory in a nearby town. Paramjit's determination to care for her family is a point of deep pride for her sons. 45 days after his mother was killed, Harpreet spoke about her in testimony before the United States Senate. He said, "My mother was a brilliant woman, a reasonable woman. Everyone knew she was smart, but she never had the chance to get a formal education. She couldn't. As a hardworking immigrant, she had to work long hours to feed her family, to get her sons educated, to help us achieve our American dreams. This was more important to her than anything else. But now she's gone because of a man who hated her because she wasn't his color or his religion. She was an American, but this was not our American dream." So I wonder if we could just take a moment of silence for the community in Oak Creek and all victims of hate violence. Thank you. The rest of the chapter on Oak Creek goes on to talk about how hate violence is not new in our communities, how it has existed since the Bellingham riots in 1907 to the assault on Rishi Maharaj, a young teenager right here in Queens, to, of course, what has been happening to our communities post 9/11. And it also talks about how hate crimes are classified legally in our country and what we need to do to come up with community responses to address it and hopefully prevent it. So the book is challenging and difficult in terms of bringing up issues like this, but where I found the hope and the inspiration to continue writing was really in the voices of young people who populate this book and who populate our communities all over the country. People like Kamal, who I spoke about, but also people like Faiza, who actually used to work at the Arab American Association of New York and was a visible actor in dealing with the Park 51 crisis here in New York City. Or Droost, who is a young Kurdish Muslim refugee who lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and has been dealing with the onslaught against Muslim and immigrant communities there. Or Yves Gomes, who's an undocumented Indian American who has been raising his own voice and pushing forward his own story of detention and deportation to raise awareness in our communities about the immigration system. And these young people are disruptors and they're bridge builders. And so they disrupt narratives that we have become accustomed to. And then that's the next picture we'll show you about saying we're not your model minority, right? They also are working at intersections of various movements. So proclaiming that we are Desi and queer and that we are also undocumented. This is Bhupin, who also appears in the book, who is undocumented, gay, Fijian American who lives in Los Angeles. And it also looks at how our communities are organizing people. Desi's Rising Up and Moving, it's this picture here, a group right here in Queens, as you likely know, organizing working class and documented people to actually build power in community to address and push back against policies like racial and religious profiling. And what is also happening in our communities is a solidarity movement. And that has in particular been something that we have seen highlighted, especially with the movement for Black Lives. And South Asian, Arab, Muslim communities are standing strong in support of the movement for Black Lives. And I think that we're still in the process of figuring out how to do it, right? How can we be more than bystander supporters? How can we do more than show up with signs, right? What can we be doing to address anti-Black racism in our own communities, to build the connections between the war on crime and the war on terror? So these are the types of conversations and dialogues and disruptions that we're seeing in our communities in terms of the solidarity movements as well. And so I want to point out two quick examples of, to me, where solidarity really looks like. This is going to take us back to Oak Creek, Wisconsin. When I attended the memorial service last August in Oak Creek, I noticed that many of the young people there were holding pictures of not just the Sikhs who had died in Oak Creek, but also of African Americans who had been killed by another white supremacist in a church in South Carolina just months ago. And that sort of connection of saying that we are connected in pain, but we are also connected in terms of justice and standing together is something that has been repeatedly happening in our communities. And this next picture is actually in front of the mosque in Murfreesboro, which I also write about in my book, where Black Latino leaders came together with Muslim, South Asian, Arab leaders to show solidarity and support and to make those links between histories of oppression and also how we challenge those oppressions. So I want to end by giving you a call to action. I think that most of you have a postcard on your chair, so if you flip to the back of it, you'll see that I'm asking folks who are moved by what you hear or read to take a pledge of action yourselves, right? That adage that change begins with each of us. And I've been thinking about and talking a lot about Dr. King's message of the fierce urgency of now, that we can no longer wait for others, we can no longer sit back, right? It is each of us who has to attend to what is happening in our country and our communities. So an acronym that I've been using a lot is BUILD, building bridges, understanding shared values and histories, informing and being informed, leading with language of solidarity, and of course, my favorite word, disrupting the status quo of narratives. And on the next slide, there are a couple of examples of how people around the country have responded to those postcards, on those postcards. So if you are moved to do that, I ask you to put down your pledge, and you can actually also put down your name and your mailing address and give me those postcards back. And in a couple of months, I will send them back to you to remind you of your pledge and to connect you to any resources that I can. But folks say things like, the hardest thing, I will have conversations with my family members about Islamophobia, right? I will build relationships with local places of worship. I will ask my elected officials to take a pledge to refrain from using divisive rhetoric. So these are all ways in which individually or structurally or institutionally we can start to take a stance to disrupt the climate of fear, the climate of suspicion that exists, and to build more multiracial and inclusive communities for all of us. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it over to Hina, and we're going to engage in a conversation and reflect a little bit on some of the themes that I've talked about, and then looking forward to hearing from all of you to hear your thoughts and your questions as well. Thank you.